Welcome to our first APES video lecture for homework. So today we're going to talk about just a very basic introduction to ecosystems and a couple of conservation terms that are important for you to know. This is like a introductory unit in our AP Environmental Science. We'll get into more specifics later, but you're going to use this information as you work on your National Parks project. And it's also important to generally understand how the natural world works so we can understand how we can use the natural resources that we have sustainably. So here we go. Let's jump right in. First of all, one thing that we're going to talk about is the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a coin or a phrase that was coined around environmental science. It's based on the idea of the commons, which is like an old English practice in like medieval towns of having a common pasture where you turned out your sheep or your flock or your cows or whatever it was you were raising, and they all like grazed in the same area. What sort of tends to happen is if you think about common spaces, like think about your student commons, right? Here at Newman, if when students hang out there, do they treat that area in the same way that they treat their like bedrooms or their own private spaces? And I think for most students, the answer is sort of no. That's why we have times during the year where you're not allowed to use the commons because everyone's left trash in it and made it all disgusting. Well, essentially, that's what the tragedy of the commons is. It's that the idea that commonly owned spaces or resources have a tendency to be used unsustainably or used less carefully than you would use your own private resources. Sometimes this is intentional. Think of like if there is a common snack that's available for everybody. You might not be hungry right now, but you know you're going to be hungry later, so you go ahead and take some snack. And maybe somebody later who's like really hungry right now doesn't get some snack. Whereas if like that was your own personal snack, you probably wouldn't take it and eat it right now because you're not hungry. So the tragedy of the commons is just the idea that spaces that are not privately owned or spaces that are looked at as available to everyone are often misused. And we'll probably do an activity soon that demonstrates this idea. The other big concept of sort of an overarching idea of environmental science that we're going to talk about today is the concept of an externality. Now, an externality is an economic concept. And this is something that comes up again and again in environmental science because so many environmental damages are caused by externalities, by their costs of things that we pay for, that we value, but we don't include the environmental damage in their cost, and that makes it an externality. So here is a slide from an economic class where negative production externalities are costs imposed on others that like the consumer's not paying for and the factory is not paying for, but general like population is having to pay for it. So pollution is often an externality. Any environmental damage is usually an externality. It's not factored into the price of the object. So like take gasoline, for example. One of the quotes on the wall says gas should really be much higher because it causes burning. It causes so much damage to the environment. That's an example of an externality. It's a cost that is significant for people, usually like the government or the general population has to pick up the cost because that cost isn't factored in to the price of a consumer good. So consumers aren't paying the cost, factories aren't paying the cost, which leads the government or the general populace to pick up the cost. And pollution is a big example of an externality, really any environmental damage. So you see here methane emissions, collapsing fish stocks, all of those things are externalities because they're not included in the price of the objects that we pay. So when we're consumers, that's one of the ways in which we really harm the environment is by taking in those resources and not paying for fixing the problems that they cause in the world and in the environment. So that's an externality. So you'll see externalities pop up a lot throughout the year. So those are two general ideas that we'll talk about in this unit. We'll talk about more and more general ideas as they fit in. But for now, we're going to get more into understanding ecosystems because that's one of the big aspects of your Natural Parks project is to understand the ecosystem of your national park. Well, you got to know what an ecosystem is before you can analyze the ecosystem of your national park. So in general, if we're looking at the entire Earth, there are four major ways that life on Earth is supported. Four things that basically make Earth different from every other planet so that life could evolve here. One of them is the atmosphere, and the atmosphere contains multiple layers, two of which are hugely important for supporting life. The first is the troposphere, which is the layer closest to the Earth. That's where the weather happens. It's where we live, where we breathe, where we put pollution, all of those. It's the most dense part of the atmosphere. It's the closest to the Earth. It's where the most gravity is pulling everything together. It has the most atoms. Then you have the stratosphere, which is the layer right above the troposphere. It contains the ozone layer. You've probably heard of the ozone layer, that there's a hole in it, that there's some environmental issues about it. It's actually getting better. It's a success story in environmental science, is that the ozone layer is actually being repaired. That is one step above the troposphere. Some jets fly in the stratosphere, not all of them, but some of them. And that's where that protective ozone layer is, which protects us from UV light. That's why the ozone layer is a good thing. We'll talk more about that when we talk about air pollution, because that's how it got eaten away. So the atmosphere are the gases that surround the Earth and sort of everything from the crust above. Then you have the hydrosphere. The hydrosphere is water. Right, so this is all of the water on Earth. Most of the Earth is actually covered by water, so the hydrosphere is a big part of the Earth. We can also include the evaporated water in the atmosphere, so there's a little bit of overlap here. And the hydrosphere is important because the fact that water exists on Earth in all three stages is important for sustaining life, particularly the liquid phase. We have liquid water. Life as we know it cannot exist without liquid water. And so it's one of the things that makes our planet perfect for life, in that like Goldilocks zone. Then we have the geosphere. The geosphere is like the rock layer. It's the Earth part. It goes from the crust, which is along the edge of the Earth. Whoops. No. Sorry about that. It's going to go all the way from the crust to the core. So it's going to be all of the solid-ish parts of the Earth. So it's like the Earth itself. Terra firma, right? That our actual ground and everything underneath it. And then you have the biosphere. The biosphere consists of all of the living organisms on the Earth. So the plants, the animals, the bacteria. The biosphere actually works together to help support itself, right? To help support life. Without the insects, for example, we would have major problems on Earth. Without bacteria, we wouldn't be able to get a lot of the nutrients that we need. So all of the biosphere works together in order to support life. So those are the four major life supporting systems of the Earth. Quick physics things that we have to talk about in environmental science. For ecosystems get energy, and they get energy from outside of the system. In fact, all of the energy on the Earth comes from the sun, from solar radiation. Ultimately, that's where it begins. There are two laws of thermodynamics we have to talk about here. The first is the law of conservation of energy, and the second is the law of entropy. The first is just the idea that energy, all the energy that has ever been around, has ever been created, is the same amount of energy that was always there. All it can do is transform. So energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. On the Earth, we get new energy every day from the sun, but that energy is coming from the sun itself, which has that energy. It's just transferred here over time. We get it in the form of UV radiation, most of which is absorbed by the ozone. And visible light, which is much of what actually makes it to the Earth's crust, and heat, which is infrared light just under that visible light. All of that's going to come onto the Earth. Some of it gets reflected by the atmosphere. The Earth actually traps some of that heat. It gets re-radiated back out into the atmosphere as heat, which is a lower form of energy than the visible light, a less organized form of energy. But our atmosphere will actually trap some of that and bounce back to Earth. That's called the greenhouse effect. It's really important for stabilizing the temperatures on our planet. So we like that there's a greenhouse effect. Later, we will talk about global warming and how the greenhouse effect is increasing, and that's less good. But that there is a greenhouse effect is very positive. And so that heat energy is trapped by our atmosphere, certain chemicals called greenhouse gases, and that's a good thing. It's like having a little blanket on Earth, this insulation. So the first law of thermodynamics, you can't create or destroy energy. You can only transfer it from one form to another. The second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy, which essentially means that disorder is favored. So in every energy transfer, you're going to lose some energy as heat. Now, it's not that energy disappears. It just gets converted into heat, and that heat is not very useful. It's a less organized form of energy, and it can't really be used. So you are going to lose usable energy as you go through different energy transversions. Within an ecosystem, you have energy and you have nutrients. Nutrients are actually chemical pieces of matter. They're actual like atoms, and they cycle in and around the ecosystem through the food web. So if this is your ecosystem, sort of a simplified ecosystem trapped in a box, all the nutrients in there are all the nutrients that have ever been in there. They might change forms, right? Your carbon might come out of the atmosphere into the plants as sugar, and that sugar might get eaten by an earthworm and then get released out as a waste product, and then the plants might absorb that. See, that's a cycle. It's going to move within the ecosystem. Energy, however, only goes in a one-way flow. It's going to come into the ecosystem, get transferred into different kinds of energy, and then eventually released as heat. So energy flows through an ecosystem while nutrients cycle within the energy system. That cycle of energy is because of the law of conservation of matter. You can't create new atoms, you can only rearrange them. And that's what happens throughout a food web interaction, which is an important part of an ecosystem. Ecosystem, by definition, is made up of the communities and the environment. That's biotic factors, the living organisms, and abiotic factors, the environment. What kind of soil is there? What kind of water is there? What's the wind like? What's the temperature? Those are all abiotic factors. So this is sort of an outline of the organization of life from atom to molecule to cell to organism. Organism is the most like basic individual living thing. Well, a cell is alive too, but the organism is like a full thing. Some of them are single cell. If you have a group of organisms all living in the same place at the same time, that's a population. They're all the same organism, but they're living, or the same species, but they're living in the same place at the same time. A community, which is what makes up an ecosystem, part of it, is all of the living populations in a particular place at a particular time that interact with each other. So these cowboys on their horses, the grass, the deer, the antelope, and the bison, all playing in the prairie, that would be a community because they're all there together. The grass is included because it is an organism. It's a plant. They are alive. Then if we look at the ecosystem, we actually take all of the community stuff, all the living things, and we include the environment, the non-living things of matter and energy all moving together. And all those ecosystems together make up the biosphere. A key way in which these organisms all work together is what we call trophic structure. That's a food chain or a food web. Food chain is like this thing eats that thing, which eats that thing, which eats that thing. That's not really how organisms work in a community. Really, everything eats lots of different things. So food chains make up food webs. And in those food webs, matter and energy flow from one organism to another. Anytime an organism eats a lower organism on the food chain, the matter and energy in that organism go into the other one. A little bit of heat is lost along the way, though, because of the second law of thermodynamics. So we'll look at how that energy determines trophic structure. Here's an example of a food web, a little bit more simple. We have our producers. Those are our plants that make their own food, right? They do photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, and they make their own food. That's our producer level, typically plants on Earth. Not always. Sometimes it's bacteria. Then we have consumers. You have different levels of consumers: primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. You usually only have up to 4 levels, though, because of energy loss in each level. And so you can see here, oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to cycle through. The oxygen is going to be made by the plants. It's going to be absorbed by the consumers. Then it will be carbon dioxide will be breathed out by the consumers and absorbed by the plants. So you have a nice little cycle of nutrients there. When the primary consumers, which are the things that eat the producers directly, get eaten by secondary consumers, the chemicals and energy that are in this rabbit end up in the fox, except for the energy that's wasted by heat in the fox's body, converting that energy into useful fox body parts. And so we lose a little bit of energy every step as heat, second law of thermodynamics. Even food webs are really a cycle, though, because say your fox or your rabbit dies and doesn't get consumed. Well, don't worry, it's going to get decomposed by the bacteria and fungi and things that are in the soil and in the air and in the rabbit's own body, in fact, and that's going to decompose and break everything back into mineral nutrients that then plants can take up and produce sugars and things like that, which the rabbits will eat. So it's like a cycle. It's the circle of life. A little more close up on these detritivores and decomposers. There's a difference between them. Detritivores are animals that eat dead stuff, but they don't actually break it down into soil nutrients. So they just eat it. These are consumers, right? Decomposers are organisms like bacteria and fungi that actually break organic materials down into inorganic materials, into nutrients in the soil that only plants can use and take up. These things, these consumers, these detritus feeders, they take the organic chemicals that are in this wood and turn it into more organic chemicals. So that's an important difference between them. Here's sort of a final slide summarizing the roles of consumers, chemicals, producers,